Canada is broken down into a few regions. Out in the west coast, you have the hippies that love weed, high real estate prices, and socialism. On the other side of the Rocky Mountains, you coincidentally have the oil barons and the people that worship Milton Friedman. They also ride bulls in arenas sometimes. The prairies and the Midwest are filled with a bunch of people that know every single word to Life is a Highway and think that a good Friday night involves a bonfire, a case of beer, and arguing over whether John Deere is better than Case IH. These people also think that apocalyptic winters are just a little bit chilly. In southern Ontario is where you'll find the colonies of India, China, and the Philippines, as many of the major cities of Canada are located here and have more than half of their populations being composed of people that are not born in Canada. The oligarchs of Canada also typically have their headquarters here, and the glorious emperor lives in this area as well. He can occasionally be seen at Taylor Swift concerts or starring in plays of Arabian Nights. Then we have Quebec. They speak French, they hate Canada, and want to leave. Also, they are viewed by France as kind of the hillbillies of the French language, but they have beautiful architecture that they all smoke in constantly, so I guess that's cool. The eastern provinces are filled with people who speak English but with Irish and Scottish accents. In fact, you could argue that this is the 5th official language of Canada, number 1 obviously being Punjabi, number 2 being English, number 3 being obviously Mandarin, number 4 French, and number 5 is whatever the hell they speak out east. They also love fish and having pubs on every street corner. Now, anything in the northern regions of these provinces don't really exist. No one's ever been there. If someone says they have, they're lying to you. Bigfoot might live here with 1,000 brothers and sisters, but we can't really know for sure because they might just blend in with the 4 humans that live there. We're not sure. And lastly, we have northern Canada. So the story goes that a bunch of people moved up here to make money during the gold rush and diamond rush days, but then some of them stayed and turned into White Walkers that founded the cities of Yellowknife, Iqaluit, and Whitehorse. Sometimes these people come down from beyond the territory border wall, and they get questioned like they are from another planet, because, well, they kind of are. But now the question is, how could a country like this just end and fall? But there's actually a rising sentiment that now Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and maybe Manitoba might in the near future try to leave as well. You see, these provinces bring home a lot of economic bacon, but all of the attention goes to their fancy pants siblings in Quebec and Ontario. Here's how it works. Alberta and Saskatchewan are like Canada's oil barons, as I mentioned, drilling up money from the ground like a reverse Scrooge McDuck, while the federal government swoops in and says, thanks for the cash, now let's spend it somewhere else. In Canada, the provinces have a thing called equalization payments, where the wealthier and more fiscally responsible provinces pay more taxes, and the tax money is given to the poorer provinces that have much worse balance sheets. Every year, Alberta pays $15 billion in these taxes and receives 0 from these payments. That's $3,000 per year for every Albertan citizen. Meanwhile, Quebec gets the lion's share of equalization payments, raking in $13.2 billion in 2023 alone, which is over 66% of the total equalization pool. So how does Quebec thank Alberta for this generosity? By saying, no pipelines, merci, while still importing Albertan oil through a roundabout method just so they can avoid using the word pipeline. So the provinces that benefit from Alberta's oil money typically vote against oil projects, which is the backbone of Alberta's economy. Then there's the federal carbon tax, which Western provinces see as a direct attack on their livelihood. The Alberta oil sands industry gets villainized while urban centers in Ontario and Quebec crank up their thermostats and pretend electric cars will save the world. But let's talk about political representation. In Canada, it's all about population, which means the West's sprawling landscapes count for squat. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba combined have about 65 seats in the House of Commons, while Ontario alone has 121. That's right, Toronto and its suburbs can practically decide elections, leaving the West to feel like they're just here to provide snacks for the party. There's also the cultural alienation. Western Canadians are the Milton Friedman fanboys of this country, loving small government, low taxes, and a good old rodeo. But when decisions are made in Ottawa, they're often shaped by central Canada's values, which can feel about as relatable to Westerners as a French art film playing in an Ontario wine bar. The West wants pipelines, free markets, and more cowbell, not speeches about the Paris Climate Accords or the World Economic Forum. So to sum it up, Western Canada feels like it's footing the bill, getting ignored in the halls of power and being told its industries are evil while its cash props up the rest of the country. That's why polls from around Canada show that between 21% and 50% of Albertans, depending on the year and the poll, would vote to secede from Canada. And some of these movements also just don't want to leave Canada, but they also want to join the United States. One plan wants Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and BC to become America's 51st state. There's also another proposed plan called Cascadia, consisting of British Columbia, Washington State, and Oregon forming their own state. This would become one of the most socialist states in the entire world. And it doesn't have too much support because it involves two countries and it's pretty complicated. Regardless, Canada isn't necessarily on the brink of having a province leave within the next few years. However, these issues will almost certainly come up again within the next decade or two, as these movements do get serious traction every now and then. Now, before we move on to some more domestic hot topics, I do want to talk about some of the potential geopolitical risks that Canada faces within the next few years and decades. 1. Alliances. You see, here in Canada, the people have typically felt safe and secure with our cozy, warm blanket of the United States military protecting us from any aggressor. Canada is also geographically isolated from every other nation outside of the United States, although it is relatively close to Greenland. And I guess you never know when the people of Greenland are going to unite and rise up to liberate the people of Canada. But outside of the threat of the Empire of Greenland rising and realizing their manifest destiny, Canada's only neighbor is the United States. And for a while, the United States and Canada have had good relations, apart from the occasional burning down of the White House or the push to annex all of Canada in the 1800s. In fact, many Canadians used to have some sort of moral superiority complex over the United States, as Canada has always had more progressive social policies. This superiority was kind of summed up by Rick Mercer's joke of, "Canada, we're bigger and we're on top. If this was prison, they would be our bitch." But in reality, tensions have been slightly rising over the past few years. You see, Donald Trump plans to put a bunch of tariffs on Canada, citing a history of bad trade deals against the United States. And the potential next Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, plans to place retaliatory tariffs on the United States if that were to happen. This is essentially creating a trade war within the second largest trade relationship in the entire world. That's right, this trade relationship in the entire world is only slightly smaller than that of the trade relationship between China and the United States. So if this were to happen, Canada's economy would almost certainly enter an immediate recession, while the United States would also hurt a little bit, but maybe not recession-worthy levels of hurt. But next up is Canada's military. You see, Canada was once known for having some of the most elite special forces in the world, along with having some of the most badass and psychopathic military personnel as well. Whether it was throwing grenade-filled soup cans into the German trenches in World War I, or someone like Leo Major, who accomplished one of the most unbelievable feats in all of World War II. Actually, let's talk about that for a second. Leo Major was on a recon mission to the city of Zwolle in the Netherlands, which was under occupation of the Germans in World War II. But within a day or two, depending on what accounts you believe, he killed several German soldiers and talked to a German soldier and told him that a large Canadian army was coming and that the Germans should retreat. Leo Major then started shooting every gun he could find in the streets and throwing every grenade he had into random walls. And he was doing this to try to single-handedly scare off the entire German occupation by simulating a fake firefight in the streets of Zwolle. And as it turned out, the Germans left. Now, whether they believed his story, whether it was a coincidence that maybe out of all days during the war that this was the night that they chose to leave, maybe this story was just an exaggeration, who knows. But the story does have enough truth where Zwolle and the Netherlands honor him annually and named a major street after him in the city of Zwolle. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that Canada's military used to punch well above its weight. Meanwhile, today, it's fallen drastically behind. Canada hasn't updated its aircraft since the 1980s, and most of its navy is from the 1990s or earlier. In fact, one of the Navy's still commissioned ships that's an actual part of the Canadian Navy is the HMCS Oriole, which is a sailboat built in 1921. So how did all of this military decline happen? Well, after about the 1960s, Canada pretty much stopped investing in the military while hitting its lowest levels right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and at the end of the Cold War. And to be fair, most European nations did this as well. But right now, the once great Canadian military would not be ready for any potential war or conflict they are involved in. Canada only has 72,000 military personnel today, yet when Canada had a population that was 38% smaller in 1989, 89,000 people were enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces. That's right, Canada is not prepared for the incoming invasion from Greenland. Now, NATO expects all members to spend around 2% of a country's GDP on the military, yet Canada only spends 1.37% of its GDP on its military. And currently, the Prime Minister Trudeau says that maybe by 2032, we could get that number up to 1.72%. The only countries that are doing worse on hitting their targets for military spending in NATO are Spain, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Virtually every other nation in NATO is near or above the 2% target. And the top NATO members have been seriously pushing this issue onto Canada. Why? Well, it's not because of any current conflict, actually. It's because of defending Canada's polar bears. You see, one issue that has been creeping up more and more over the years and will over the next few decades is the issue of the Canadian Arctic. Why is this a military issue? Well, Canada's Arctic is relatively undefended, yet is becoming less and less icy every single year, meaning that the once frozen waters of the north may soon become traversable for those that NATO deems as enemies. All of a sudden, Russian or Chinese ships could traverse the world unhindered because Canada only has 9 ships capable of defending the Arctic as of right now, while a country like Russia has nearly 40. But there's also the defense against the Danes. You see, Canada has actually been going through one of the longest wars in history. The War of the Whiskey, aka the War of Hans Island, which actually lasted from 1973 to 2022, nearly 5 decades. And over that time, Denmark and Canada have been fighting over the island by occasionally planting flags and leaving their own domestic whiskey as a warning to the other country to not intrude on their land. However, the war finally came to an end in 2022 when Denmark and Canada decided to split the island right down the middle. Remember how I said that Canada is isolated from every other country in the world except the United States and Greenland? Well, that was a lie. Canada now actually shares a border with Denmark. And again, at any point in time, those Danes could call upon the spirit of their Viking ancestors and invade and raid Canadian territory. If they were to do this, Canada would be woefully unprepared. But getting back to the Canadian Arctic, with the melting of Canada's Arctic, new economic opportunities are also emerging. Canada's Arctic might become the shortest shipping route between China and some European countries or the eastern United States. Canada's Arctic also might have more oil than all of Canada's oil sands combined, meaning that in the future, the Arctic could become a hotspot for new oil barons and create another state like Alberta. There's also an obscene amount of rare earth elements, diamonds, gold, zinc, uranium, and loads of other resources located up there. All this means that you can bet your bottom dollar that other countries will want a slice of the Canadian Arctic in the future, and Canada has to be able to defend its territory. But now we move on to the more domestic topics of Canada and why they may result in the downfall of the country. You know, there's this thing that started happening in Canada within the last decade of making land acknowledgements before every speech to the indigenous populations like the Iroquois. And if people want to do that, cool, good for you. But the trouble with this kind of stuff is that many of the land acknowledgements are actually just acknowledging the previous conquerors of the land. I mean, the Iroquois Confederacy was one of the largest populations of indigenous people in North America, and they did this by expanding their territory, taking over land from tribes like the Huron, the Erie, and so on. And those tribes likely did the same to those that came beforehand. Now, this is not a justification for colonialism and so on. The point I'm trying to get across here is that Canada is having a crisis with its history and cultural identity. They're kind of having this postmodern worldview that is deciding to rewrite history for modern cultural and social points. In fact, Justin Trudeau had once said that Canada does not have a core identity. And almost every politician says that Canada has always been a land of immigrants as a justification for opening the borders with almost no controls over the past few years. Now, I've mentioned this before in a ton of videos, but I will bring it up briefly here again. Canada is having the largest population explosion in the history of the modern Western world. And this is largely due to immigration of young men from India, China, and the Philippines. Canada's population has gone from 36.9 million in 2021 to nearly 42 million as of right now. This in itself single-handedly caused a gender imbalance by now having nearly 11% more young men than women, which is a gender disparity similar to that you would see in China when they had their one-child policy, or Russia after World War II when most of the men died. Now, this immigration helped keep wages low for corporations, and it also helped bring problems from every other country to Canada. You see, Canada historically has had the occasional riot, protest, or gang warfare, but that always had to do with domestic issues in Canada. But now these things are happening with things that don't even have to do with Canada inside Canada though. For example, thousands of pro-Khalistan protesters are fighting outside of Sikh and Hindu temples for a separatist movement that's on the other side of the planet. There's also other things like the USA has caught 1,200 foreign terrorists that have tried to come into the United States from Canada, but were only caught by the United States Border Patrol, not Canadian ones. But they went undetected by Canadian immigration systems. In Canada, we've also seen the burning of about 100 churches over the last few years. There's now large protests calling for white people to go back to Europe, and some of these protests chanting "Death to Canada" while in Canada. Oh, the irony of that one. Over the last 50 years, the fastest growing religious affiliation in Canada was not religious or atheism or agnosticism, but now over the last 10 years it is currently Islam, where now major Toronto streets are being shut down just to pray. Now, I'm not trying to disparage the culture of others, I'm not trying to disparage the religion of others. The point I'm trying to make here is that having an open borders policy and bringing in people pretty much without immigration controls, and having people come from conflicting cultures or places that are typically separated by borders between countries that hate each other, and having them live next to each other in a Toronto neighborhood, it can lead to social unrest, I would say. Now, I myself am not a religious person at all, despite being baptized Greek Orthodox, hence my love for mentioning Greece and Hellenism in every video I can. You malakas. You see, despite what everyone says, Canada's identity pre-2010 or pre-2000 or so was largely a secularized Christian nation. It was essentially a homogenous country, and when prime ministers used to say it was a land of immigrants, the immigrants were largely from other Christian nations with similar cultures that had easy integration into Canadian society. And historically, there have been plenty of examples of when massive amounts of people from a different culture immigrate to a country and it causes tension. You can look at examples like mass immigration of the Irish escaping the Great Famine and moving to the United States in the 19th century, or the example of Indians moving to Uganda in the 20th century, or the Greeks moving to the city of Alexandria in Egypt in the 18th century to restore the rightful Greek claim of the Byzantine Empire. All of these examples caused events that ranged from riots to coups that toppled governments. And we're not talking about things that happened thousands of years ago. Some of these only happened 50 years ago. The point I'm trying to make here is that historically, a massive influx of people with different cultures almost always increases social unrest within a country, and sometimes leads directly to the fall of the country. One of the biggest cases is actually the Visigoths of the Roman Empire. Now, this one goes back a few thousand years. They were taken in as refugees within the Roman Empire after the Huns' invasion of Eastern Europe, and within 50 years, the Visigoths ended up forming their own army and sacking Rome, and eventually forming their own kingdom in modern-day France and Spain. Now, I'm not saying that Canadian immigrants are going to rise up and create the Kingdom of Khalistan in Brampton, Ontario, but I'm also saying that it's not entirely impossible either. We will see if Tim Hortons turns into some armories in the near future. But if you are Canadian though, you know one thing that is a real primary issue within the country right now, and that is that housing costs are too damn high. Canada has the housing prices of New York, the wages of Mississippi, and taxes higher than any state in America. Now, I won't stay on this topic for too long because of how much I talk about this in my other videos, but Canada has the highest cost of housing to income ratio in the entire Western world, although depending on the day or the month, Portugal could be ahead. Now, I could talk about how the average one-bedroom condo in any Canadian city costs as much as the typical semi-detached or detached home in most European cities. But I'm not going to do that, because I just want to show you some numbers about Canada's housing and its economy. What's the largest portion of Canada's economy? Well, it is buying and selling real estate. Not manufacturing, not services, not technology. Buying and selling houses is Canada's economic backbone. Sounds pretty healthy, right? But it's got some more problems. Canada's public sector is rapidly outpacing its private sector. Canada's entrepreneurship rate has fallen off a cliff over the last 25 years, where only a few 100,000 self-employed people are left in the country. And speaking of that, Canada has one of the worst brain drains in the entire world, as between 0.3% and 0.7% of Canada's entire population moves to the United States every single year. Investment in Canada is also leaving the country faster than any other G20 nation at peace in the last 100 years, as around $1 trillion in net FDI investment will have left Canada by the end of 2024, meaning that investors are leaving Canada at a pace that would have been crazy to say 20 years ago. Because about 20 years ago, Canada was a net positive importer of investment abroad, but now virtually every business and investor is leaving the country. Canada also has a severe underemployment crisis, but this is also true in lots of Europe as well. Canada has a productivity crisis that is at the same level as what is viewed as the most unproductive country in Europe, which is Italy. Canada's real GDP per capita has been declining for over a year and a half in a row, which means that it has been in a recession for about a year and a half. Canada's insolvencies of businesses are hitting levels that haven't been seen since the 1990s, when per capita Canada had twice as many small businesses. And now this all just sounds horrible. But here's some good news for you all, because according to Canada's Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Canada is not in a recession at all. In fact, she calls it a vibe session. The economy looks great on paper, and it looks great to the elite and the politicians, even though it's the exact opposite of pretty much what every Canadian thinks. But the real issue here is that Canada's economy has become so dependent on real estate that it is artificially propping up its own real estate market by the government taking out debt to stimulate the already insanely expensive housing market and keep prices as high as they can be. Why are they doing this? Because the second that prices drop, the entire economy will fail. In fact, not a single political party leader has said the words, "Housing prices should come down." Because every politician knows two things. One, just by saying that, you would lose the vote of a lot of homeowners. Two, this would also mean that Canada would enter a recession or potentially a crisis similar to what Greece went through in the late 2000s and early 2010s. You see, Greece went through a horrific financial crisis that doesn't really have a comparison over the last 20 years for any developed nation. But yet today, Greece is said to have not only recovered from that horrible crisis, but also gone through its second economic miracle in the country's history. Now, I'm not saying that Greece has a terrific economy, nor am I saying that it's great for the average person in Greece. But by many metrics, its economy is in a much more stable place than it was before the crisis. Unemployment is lower than it was for most of the 2000s. Its IT, R&D, and tech sectors have almost tripled in size since then. Its renewable energy sector has become amongst the fastest growing and most idolized in the entire world. The point I'm trying to get here is that Greece's crisis, even though it was horrific, it may in the long term have diversified Greece's economy and helped the middle class in the long run. So what could Canada learn from this? Well, this is a part of economics which I would like you to leave a comment about. Myself, along with many economists, believe that corrections, recessions, and downturns in an economy are needed to keep the natural order of an economy intact. The boom-bust cycle. Yet today's governments and modern economists will adopt things like modern monetary theory amongst other policies, stating that we can always take out debt and print money to prevent recessions, and asset corrections can never really happen. Everything will just keep going up forever and ever. Essentially, this is disturbing the natural economic cycle that is needed to correct asset prices and force innovation in the economy. It is also used to balance the playing field so that sometimes the middle class can catch up and and things like bloated giant zombie companies can get flushed away. I mean, think about it. If a bunch of rich people or investors can just buy houses and see prices go up by 5 to 10% every single year, then why even bother starting a business in Canada? Buying a house with skyrocketing investment value is a business in itself. But if prices came down and middle-class people could afford average homes again, then Canada's economy could potentially begin diversifying, where people can save up enough money to start a business or take on a risky job at a startup company that's trying to do something new rather than go to work at an established mega corporation that is more stable. Investors would be forced to find other investments in Canada because if housing is no longer a great investment, then they would have to find something else to do with their money. Actually, do you know what the two most innovative times for an economy are? The two most innovative times for an economy actually occur typically during war and during recessions. But yet, no politician ever wants to have a recession be under their rule. So, unless the economy significantly changes under the probable future Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre, Canada will likely have housing costs that stay the same or keep rising, taxes will remain amongst the highest in the world still, a true asset price correction won't really happen, and Canada may fall into an economic abyss. But there is hope. I believe that Pierre is the most economically literate party leader that Canada has had in quite some time. I have followed him for many years, well before he became the leader for the Conservative Party, and I think it is possible for his party to do a litany of positive economic reforms that could save Canada from falling off a cliff. But will these reforms happen? I'm not sure. I'm always quite skeptical of any government that comes into power in any country, but I think this is Canada's best shot, so we will see what happens in the election of 2025.